All right, if all is going as planned, this is now being recorded, so keep that in mind, please. And there's your written notice that we are recording. Okay, so for today, what we hope to do is, first of all, inform you, all of you flying wild stakeholders, about the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies' efforts to consolidate and streamline flying wild training and distribution through the network of state Project Wild hosting organizations, and also to invite feedback from you all. We're going to start this by me giving you some history, a lot of information here that you're welcome to read it all or come back to it later if it really interests you, but I'm really going to focus on a few parts of this timeline that are most relevant to help explain the state of the Flying Wild program today and how we got where we are and why we're deciding to go for our next steps in our new direction. So back around 2001, I don't know the exact date, but there were a number of people involved in educating about birds, particularly migratory birds, and there was interest in expanding the efforts of International Migratory Bird Day, now World Migratory Bird Day, and that became the Flying Wild program. The vision was to have a parallel program that would be implemented in schools and help communities do even more with bird festivals and learning about birds. So in that first section under 2002 to 2004, that era of funding and development, a key part of that was the role of the Project Wild Network. The National Fish and Wildlife Foundation was particularly interested in working with the Council for Environmental Education, which used to be the National Office for Project Wild, to develop and launch this program. And it was largely because of Project Wild's track record and history. And also the Project Wild network was really key in helping develop the content. And some of you who may be on the call today were involved in those early efforts in the early 2000s of helping review drafts, helping circulate content to your networks for field testing, in some case putting us in touch with experts from your agency for review. In 2004, we launched the Flying Wild Guide. That was when the first edition, the first printing came out. And so with that effort, we also began the work of building a new city partner network. And the purpose for the City Partner Network I'll get into in just a bit, but that effort I would say lasted for about 12 years. And also during this time we continued the work of establishing grant funding sources from groups like, well, in particular, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation was involved for the 3-year development grant, followed by some smaller regional grants to help launch Flying Wild, ConocoPhillips. We also received funding from the Environmental Education Training and Partnership, which is a consortium of environmental education organizations that work through a national EPA grant.
Mark, this is
Yes.
Elena. I'm sorry to interrupt. And while we do love to see your lovely face, can you maybe not do the video because sometimes the voice, the sound goes in and out.
Okay,
and I think it's just a
Sure.
bandwidth issue. Thanks. Sorry about that.
Well, thank you for letting me know. Hold on just a moment. Okay. All right, so 2010 to 2016, this was a period where the city partners were, that network was maintained. Occasionally we would have a new city partner come on and we would have some drop out. And I'm guessing we typically average probably around 15 to 20, sometimes 25 city partners. I don't have that number actually offhand, that's just a rough estimate. But those were throughout the United States and in Saskatchewan. And so during these years, much of the Flying Wild training and distribution went through these local city partner organizations. And it's also true that from the beginning, much of Flying Wild training and distribution was also going on just within the Project Wild network through the coordination of state Project Wild coordinators. And of course, those two networks closely overlap and interconnect. All right. And then in 2017, as many of you know, the National Office for Flying Wild, as well as all of the programs of the Council for Environmental Education, transferred to the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. The Council for Environmental Education made the decision to close up shop and transfer everything, just about everything, to AFWA. And so that includes Project Wild and Flying Wild, Aquatic Wild, and Growing Up Wild, our early childhood program. So the rationale for the Flying Wild City Partner Network when Flying Wild was being developed was for three main reasons: to increase capacity for education about migratory birds, to tap into new networks for funding and education, and to involve a greater diversity of organizations. And these now are some of the challenges that we're facing, especially in the last 5 years, that are why we are looking at new directions. So first of all, the cost of maintaining the city partner network is greater than the revenue connected to Flying Wild. Also, in letter B here, grants, especially federal grants, have been more difficult to acquire and manage than in Flying Wild's early days. We've had a reduction in sales, and I'll show you a bit more information on that later. So less revenue coming in to support the program. And also less participation and engagement with the city partner network. And there's various reasons for that, which I'll also mention in a minute. Other reasons include general trends in environmental education and how formal education works, in the economy, such as the recession in 2007, 2008. Those all had big impacts on the distribution and the involvement in Flying Wild. Some other challenges have been with Flying Wild since the beginning, but maybe were compounded with less people knowing about it or participating. And that is, in letter F here, the relevancy of the festival aspect of Flying Wild. There was some confusion about what the festival was all about. Is the festival the main part of Flying Wild? Is it a necessary or mandatory part of implementing Flying Wild? And the answer there is no, it's not all about the festival. We've always seen the festival as just a really good option if you're able to do it. But nonetheless, we learned that was sometimes a barrier to getting more people involved. And letter G here points out that the relevancy of the three different kinds of activity types, teacher-led, volunteer-led, and student-led, has also been somewhat confusing. And again, this is compounded when there's less people in the know who are sharing information via word of mouth. People who are just coming to the program who don't know anyone else connected with it have a greater learning curve with these different types of activities to understand what they're about, and it might be something that they think may be more challenging to pick up than people who've gone through the training. And then letter H, so the visibility and usability as a science education resource. So Flying Wild has always been cross-curricular, connecting with subjects that are taught in schools, all subjects. But like most environmental education programming in North America, we have a very close alliance with science education. And if science educators aren't seeing it as something that's designed for them to use, it might not even make it onto their radar. All right, so this is a snapshot of Flying Wild distribution, the sale of Flying Wild guides since 2011, 2012. And if you took this back further, you would see even much larger numbers that were distributed prior to 2010 from the launch in 2004. But as I said, we've seen a decline in sales, and so we're having to rethink how we distribute the guide as well as make other plans. In this slide, we are looking at distribution in 2019. And so the dark purple here are Project Wild state coordinators who have purchased or authorized their agency to purchase Flying Wild guides for distribution through their Project Wild network. And then the light purple, which is Texas, is where we've relied primarily on city partner organizations to this date for the distribution of Flying Wild. And then you can see Illinois is kind of in between there. Now, 10 years ago, you would have seen several other states that were a combination, or in the very light purple, where there was a lot more city partner involvement. So I wanted to pause here and let you all let us know who you are in terms of a Flying Wild stakeholder. For example, you might be a Project Wild state coordinator, you might be a Project Wild facilitator, or you might have been trained as a Flying Wild facilitator, or maybe both. You might be a Flying Wild local coordinator, someone who's been with the program for a long while, and you're employed by historically one of the city partner organizations. And of course, you might fit multiple categories here. But if you could quickly in the chat box describe your identity as a Flying Wild stakeholder, and this meeting, which is recorded, I'll be able to go back and look later to see who all participated, and we can start to get a quick view now. So I'm going to pause a moment while you do that. Okay, so I see that there are folks that are longtime veterans for Flying Wild. In one case, folks who are planning their first workshop, which is really exciting. A lot of folks that have training in multiple programs. And this is what we expected. We really expected all sorts of Flying Wild stakeholders to be participating today. Okay, I'm going to move on. So I told you about our new challenges, and on a related note, here are some of our new needs. We are needing to more efficiently and cost effectively manage Flying Wild. We no longer have the more robust funding for the program and the support that allowed to interact as much with local or with organizations at the local level. We're needing to go more to statewide contacts, that is the Project Wild state coordinators. And then second, as I mentioned, Flying Wild transitioned to be a program of AFWA in 2017, and the whole purpose and existence for AFWA is to meet the needs of member organizations. Now, making Flying Wild available to all sorts of organizations helps meet the needs of AFWA member organizations. That is, those state fish and wildlife agencies throughout the United States, Canadian provinces, and a few others. But these member organizations are a high priority for decisions we make with Flying Wild. We're still eager to have organizations at every level and educators of all types use Flying Wild because that helps support the mission of those member organizations. But we also recognize that we have to really think about the best way to run Flying Wild efficiently in light of this change. The third bullet here is improving participation and a greater reach. Now, it used to be that improving participation and a greater reach meant a city partner network, and that is no longer the case. Fourth, keep existing and active Flying Wild partners engaged in the delivery of Flying Wild training. So this can mean a lot of things, but the bottom line is we want to make Flying Wild available in some way to anybody who wants it. Anybody who wants their organization to provide training, or anyone who wants to become a facilitator, we're eager to help with that process. And in many cases, that means us putting you in touch with your state Project Wild coordinator. But in some states, it might mean something different. Okay, and for the next bullet, another need is reducing barriers to participation in Flying Wild with current Project Wild partners. So we're looking at what are some of the problems, especially for some of the partners that have been with us for many years, or maybe they're state Project Wild coordinators. Why is it difficult in some cases for them to conduct Flying Wild? Well, it might be because the program has been different enough from the other Project Wild programs that in itself was a barrier. Or it might have been that the material in the Flying Wild guide has become somewhat dated. And there are many other reasons, but nonetheless, we are looking at those as well. And next, another need is to have a broader appeal to non-formal educators. So we have a pretty broad appeal to the non-formal world, but in particular, one that has surfaced as an area where we can perhaps do more is after-school programs. How can Flying Wild be adjusted, particularly to meet the needs of after-school programming? The next one is streamlining with Project Wild. So the idea here is to make the content in Flying Wild uniform with how content is organized with Project Wild, how we distribute Flying Wild through the Project Wild network, and training. In many cases, training is already streamlined with Project Wild training. A lot of people combine Flying Wild training and Project Wild training along with several other kinds of training, as probably almost everyone knows. But if there's anything that AFWA can do to help streamline it further, we're looking at that, and we encourage state Project Wild coordinators to do that as well. Okay, next we'll be branding Flying Wild as part of the Project Wild program. And I'll show you just a quick glimpse and just a bit on that. Improved communication and marketing. These are important needs always, but probably more so as we go forward with updating content in the Flying Wild Guide, which is the last bullet there. And it's true that communication and marketing, as well as updating the content, have been put on hold while we were busy with redeveloping content for Aquatic Wild, and then Project Wild Terrestrial, and then the transition to AFWA. So now we're circling back and trying to strengthen in those areas as well. So here is the new plan in fairly general terms, that we're continuing on with this gradual transition from a city partner network to state Project Wild hosting organizations. We're maintaining participation by individuals and organizations currently with Flying Wild city partner networks. Again, if somebody really wants Flying Wild, we want to make sure they can get it. 3, address needs in states in which there is no coordination for Flying Wild statewide. So in some states, the Project Wild coordinator might not offer Flying Wild. And so we'll work with people in the states, and as well as that state Project Wild coordinator, to figure out ways to make that available. And it might be in some cases working directly with organizations that historically have been Flying Wild City Partner organizations. For the updating of the Flying Wild Guide, and here you can see 5 bullets about that in, again, very general terms. We're going to de-emphasize the festival component. We're going to simplify the activity types, so we're going to have the activities, as in a traditional Project Wild style activity. And then we're going to have center activities that lend themselves to classroom centers, learning centers, after-school centers, festival centers. So centers is a very general term here. And then C here is new emphasis on science content. So really, making the science content emphasized, including next generation science standards. Okay, and part of that effort might be how we market it. And then letter D, moving some reference pages online, similar to what we've done with Aquatic Wild and the Project Wild Terrestrial Guide. And then finally, updating activities, given a much more limited time and budget than we had, say, when we were updating Aquatic Wild or Project Wild Terrestrial. But nonetheless, we do want to bring activities up to date. All right, and so I know, I apologize, this is a lot of information. I highlighted some of the key words here to make it easier to digest. And again, you can refer to this later, as we will be, but you don't have to read it all right now. But these are the criteria for participation as what we're calling additional hosting organizations. So rather than identifying organizations as city partner organizations, if we do end up, that is, if the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies does work directly with folks at a very local level, such as an Audubon Center, a zoo, a museum, etc., after-school center, arboretum, or in some cases it might be a facilitator that is supporting a Project Wild State coordinator. But anyway, if there's a person we're working with who's affiliated with an organization that is not part of or not directly connected to the state Project Wild network, we will be referring to you as an additional hosting organization. And really what we call you is not that important. You will see in a minute, I'll show you what it looks like when we print it in the Flying Wild Guide, but we are going to stop using the term city partner organization. Okay, so the first criteria is we would expect, or not expect, an additional Flying Wild hosting organization needs to communicate. They need to let us know they would like to still have access to Flying Wild for purchase and delivery through training. They have to provide staff qualified to deliver Flying Wild training. So that means having at least one staff member that has been trained either as a Flying Wild facilitator or a Project Wild facilitator. Now there's a caveat there we'll get to in a moment further down the list, but you have to have a facilitator on staff. The third criteria is that access is needed. That is, we're talking about groups at the local level that do not have access to Flying Wild guide purchases for the purpose of providing training via their state Project Wild program. And if Project Wild is not available in the state and you don't have a way to get it as a local organization, we need to know that, and we'll be asking that. The fourth criteria is that you purchase Flying Wild guides, and that may seem obvious. And at least for now, the minimum order will be a box. And typically that's around 12 per guide, and it probably will be in the future, but it may go up or down, but you're going to have to order at least a box to get to work with AFWA on this. Fifth criteria is to use best practices for professional development training. Okay, so for example, evaluating your workshops for quality control. And for more information about best practices, AFWA has available resources such as how to conduct a flying wild facilitator training, or a content that came originally from a flying wild manual that we would give to our partners. And so that's one resource that's available. Another one is the North American Association for Environmental Education's guidelines for best, I might be getting the title wrong, guidelines for best practices in professional development. I probably got that title wrong just a bit, but you can find it if you Google it. Okay, number 6, distribute guides at training only. So, the understanding is still that guides are not to be resold, that if you're accessing or acquiring guides from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, that they will be provided to educators at professional development workshops. Now, flying wild and like growing up wild, it still is available online for purchase. So if someone wanted to pay extra and purchase it online, one copy, they certainly could. We've never really encouraged that or marketed that. We try to steer people towards training when possible, but that is still an option. Number 7, accept future changes. So we're asking that just for everyone to keep in mind that all of these ways we're proceeding, agreements we're making, they're temporary, and that AFWA will continue to adjust the program, will continue to adjust how flying wild is distributed in various states and regions, how we do it nationally, how we do it through the State Project Wild Coordinator Network, regional trainers, possibly the use of other statewide coordinators for flying wild, and also possibly AFWA we may have our own trainers that travel around to provide flying wild training. These are all possibilities we've discussed, and we'll see how that pans out. Number 8, you have to have pre-approval from the Project Wild coordinator. So before we distribute to organizations that are not State Project Wild state hosting organizations, we're going to ask the Project Wild coordinator in the state if we have their blessing to sell flying wild guides for the purpose of a flying wild training. So that goes back to number 2. If you don't have a staff who's been certified in Project Wild or Flying Wild, then not only would AFWA not approve of it, but the State Project Wild organization probably wouldn't either. Okay, number 9, we would need organizations that participate in implementing flying wild to send data back to us. So this means submitting an annual report to AFWA, and we would send out a reporting form. In some cases, it might be that we ask you to send that data directly to the Project Wild coordinator in your state, if that is their preference, or directly back to us. Okay, we're about halfway through here, and maybe more, depends on how many questions folks might have. I do want to save time for questions, but I'm going to transition here a bit and show you some of the branding that is happening already with Flying Wild. The 2020 printing of Flying Wild will not be the updated guide. There are routine updates that we make for sure, such as especially data that's presented throughout the guide that is time sensitive or connected to particular years or spans of years. But the guide more or less is the same. One change that you will see is on the title page here. You can see it now has the Project Wild branding. And this is on the back of the title page. This is all of the small print about the organization behind Flying Wild. So in this case, of course, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And it may be too small on your screen to see it, but the first line on this page is, Flying Wild is part of Project Wild, a program of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Okay, so this is a new way for us to talk about Flying Wild as a program of Project Wild. if you were to turn the page in the 2020 edition of Flying Wild, which by the way is still at the printer, it has not been released yet. But if you were to turn the page, you will see this. This also looks new in the 2020 edition. And I wanted to include this to give you a sense of how involved the different categories of networks are and how complex and sometimes confusing, which also is another reason or another benefit of streamlining Flying Wild and help wrapping it in as part of Project Wild. So on the left, we start off with our AFWA member organizations. So these are state fish and wildlife agencies. And we put an asterisk next to each organization that's also a Project Wild hosting organization. Below that, we have AFWA members in US territories and in Canada. And then on the facing page, we have additional Project Wild hosting organizations. These are organizations that host Project Wild at the state level when Project Wild is not operated through the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, that is through the organization that is already an AFWA member. And then below that, we have yet this additional category of additional Flying Wild hosting organizations. And so for 2020, we went ahead and we listed all the organizations, maybe with a few exceptions, that we used in the last printing of Flying Wild. And these are organizations that in the past we referred to as Flying Wild City Partner Organizations. It's important for me to point out that all of the contracts or the MOUs, or they might have been called letters of agreement in some cases, but all of those contracts that were established to develop these Flying Wild City Partners, or now we call them Flying Wild Hosting Organizations, those have all expired. So currently there's no contract out that really establishes any group as an additional Flying Wild hosting organization, and we don't really have plans to renew those. It's going to be more on an informal basis without the contracts and without the policy, and we'll see how that works. And so we anticipate that in the next printing of Flying Wild that this additional hosting organization list will be much smaller. You know, I can think of a few cases where I would anticipate some organizations will still be on the list. In Saskatchewan, for example, Saskatchewan Outdoor and Environmental Education, or I think is the names, if you're on the call, you can help me out, or Kelly or Elena, you may know, but Sask Outdoors, perhaps? And sorry, yeah, okay, Sask Outdoors. And another point on that is the map I showed you earlier of the United States. If Saskatchewan was shown on the map, you'd have seen the light purple for that province as well, just as you did for Texas. Okay, so here's some key points in Flying Wild's new direction. And I think this is my last slide before we go into questions. But this is really a summary, and that is Flying Wild is a part of Project Wild. Streamlining means a Project Wild oriented revision to the guide, Project Wild branding and distribution, and when possible, through Project Wild hosts. State Project Wild coordinators are the key contacts for Flying Wild and all other Project Wild programming. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies will work on a case-by-case basis to ensure anyone who wants to participate in Flying Wild is able to do so. For most states and most organizations currently using Flying Wild, very little is changing. And finally, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies is working on revising the Flying Wild Guide with an updated edition to go to print in 2021. All right, so I'm gonna see if any of you have questions or comments. And I guess first turning to Kelly, and Elena may not be on the call at this point, but had anyone seen any comments or questions in the chat box you wanted to bring up at this time?
Yes, this is Kelly, and I will first share one question from Patsy that she was just mentioning, And then after that, I'll review a few of the questions that came up just for folks on the phone who don't have access to the chat. But one thing that Patsy asked was if they could get a PDF of those new pages in the front that has kind of that updated information. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't post those online. Does that sound right to you, Mark?
That sounds right to me. I don't see any reason why not. And I'm guessing, Patsy, that you mean the same pages that I showed the slides of. But if that's not the case, let us know. And usually for any page that's not an activity, distributing PDFs is not a problem, usually. So yeah, we'll put that on our list.
Okay. And then, oh, sorry, I'll pause in case anybody wanted to jump in. Okay. A few of the things that came up, somebody asked about the cost. This year we changed to selling guides by box to our coordinators and partners. And so it is $198 for a box of 12 guides. So that comes out to $16.50 per box. That's a $2 per guide discount because to the public it's $18.50. And that is a 50-cent price increase from last year. The guide,
if I may stop you for a moment. So did you say that that price comes out to a $16.50 per guide? Is that correct?
correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Then somebody asked also if it was still publicly available online, and that is true, it is. And as I mentioned in the chat, the online sales are not a huge percentage of our overall guide sales. The bulk of what we do is sell guides to our state coordinators and our training partners. For Growing Up Wild, I know it's about 3%. Flying Wild, it might be a little bit more, just since we don't sell the same volume of Flying Wild guides as we do with Growing Up Wild guides, but it is pretty small. To find out who coordinates Flying Wild in your state, go to flyingwild.org. We have state coordinator information there if they do include Flying Wild in their suite of trainings. We also have our city partner networks. So just for reference, for who historically has offered training, you can go there and let us know if there's anything that needs to be updated, and we will be changing that as some of the former city partners might move more into a facilitator role. So that will change over time, but you can reference that for now. And then, oh, we just talked about those pages. Let's see, we've got a couple of other questions coming in. Anne says, who should she contact about offering Flying Wild in New Mexico in the future? The answer for now would be us. So we can get email you, Anne, and get in touch about that, since right now in New Mexico we are looking for a statewide partner. We've had some conversations with a couple different organizations, but nothing that has come into fruition yet. So we can touch base with you about offering Flying Wild in New Mexico. Betsy asks, is there any way to add shipping to the box prices? Yes, we can do that, Betsy, and I will email you about that. And Patsy, should we contact our state Project Wild coordinator in Texas to find out how all this will work in Texas? Mark, maybe would you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. You probably want to get, yes, it would be good to talk with Kiki about that. And Kiki and I are in constant conversation about the possibilities. But one thing that we're waiting to see is how similar we can make Flying Wild in how the content is delivered in the guide. How similar can we make it to Project Wild? Will our time and budget allow us to really make it to where it blends in seamlessly with other Project Wild programs? I shouldn't say seamlessly, but I think you get the idea. And so that's one of several concerns and Texas Parks and Wildlife is considering this. So we'll see what happens in Texas. For right now, if you're in Texas and you want Flying Wild, you can contact me, and then I'll ask Kiki. You know, if I'll apply those criteria I mentioned before. One of which is getting Kiki's blessing. Many people who have done Flying Wild in Texas, I can't think of anyone who Kiki and I wouldn't give the blessing to, but yeah, for now, contact me and stay tuned, you know, in the future to find out what Kiki and Texas Parks and Wildlife has to say about it. I hope that answers the question. Kelly, were there any others?
Patsy asks about getting a recording or a copy of the webinar. Yes, we can send that out. We'll send it on the Flying Wild list, which I know some of you are on. We'll send it to our coordinators so that they can forward to you, just like they did with this webinar invitation. Let's see. I think we could also send it out to participants via Zoom. Does that sound right, Mark or Alina?
I think so. I think, well, I really don't know. I know through Zoom we have access to all of the emails. So it seems like we can send an email to everyone with a link to the recording. But we don't know yet if it'll come, you know, when that email comes, if it'll say it's connected to Zoom or if it's through, say, something, you know, on Google Drive.
Right, okay. Yeah, but we will get it to you, is the short answer. I think those were all the questions that I saw, but if anybody has another one, feel free to unmute yourself by pressing *6 or typing it in the chat.
Kelly, you and I had talked about people having access to Flying Wild materials to provide training. And I think, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but if they go to the Project Wild website, they will see the icon for Flying Wild and they can follow that to find Flying Wild facilitator training resources. Is that your recollection?
It is, yes, that's true, but there's not a separate login. So there are things up there like the facilitator handbook. There's some correlations to various standards. There are all of the student pages and a couple of additional resources that folks sent in to us. Those are posted. So if you go to flyingwild.org and you click resources, you can find all of that stuff there.
Okay, so flyingwild.org is the place to go.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or type into the chat box. We'll give it just another minute. And Kelly, is there anything that comes to mind for you before we sign off?
Nothing aside from thanks for joining us.
And I'll second that. Thanks. Appreciate it. And thank you for joining us on this larger Flying Wild adventure in these new directions. We're really excited about the upcoming revisions and hope that we can do our best to make it available to all of you and a broader audience. So thank you all. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my microphone. I will leave the presentation open for a minute. And if we see any questions come in, we'll answer them. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have questions that you want to ask me individually. And thank you again.